Developmental Disabilities Administration. I'm the Intake and Eligibility Supervisor. It extends from the King-Pierce County line all the way up to the Canadian border and out to the San Juan Islands. So the bulk of the eligibility work is done in Linwood, but I do have one case manager that works in the Bellingham office, and she kind of handles a lot of the intake and reapplications up there for the North Sound part of the region. Scott is correct. DDA is a pretty complicated system. If you're familiar with DSHS, DDA is an administration within DSHS. So there's DDA, and then you have the administration, Economic Services Administration, the folks that process food benefits and Medicaid eligibility, and then you have DVR as part of DSHS. There's a variety of other administrations under the broad umbrella of DSHS. So DDA is just one part of that. And thank you, DSA. Yeah, thank you, Scott. Department of Social and Health Services, and then DDA is obviously the Developmental Disabilities Administration.
That's great. Thank you both. Really appreciate it. I'll also mention that the Down syndrome community of Puget Sound is now a contracted provider of DDA. So that's also good for folks to know. So I'll just kick it off by asking some super basic questions, right? Just to be sure that we do a little bit of level setting and folks can understand the kind of the beginning steps. So to start with, Chris, if you could just talk to us a little bit about what DDA funding is and who is eligible for it, that would be super helpful.
Okay, I'll try to make it brief here. So probably the simplest way to explain DDA funding is that you've gone through the application process or the eligibility review process, and you've been determined eligible for DDA. You know, the next step is to request an assessment. So you get an assessment for services, and then the assessment identifies what kinds of services might potentially benefit the client. And then funding comes when you have approval to receive the services. So there's, you know, funding that's through Medicaid and then funding through the DDA waiver system. But in a nutshell, receiving DDA funding means that you've been approved, you're eligible, you've had an assessment, and the assessment indicates services are needed and there's available funding for you to receive those services. And I'm going to back up a little bit and just say that after the presentation or after the panel tonight, I understand that Kate is going to be sending out several handouts about DDA and some resources, and then my presentation. And there's a lot of information in there as well that I'll be referring to a little bit tonight. In terms of who's eligible for DDA, so to become eligible, you have to have a qualifying diagnosis. So that means the diagnosis has to be something like, well, not something like, but specifically intellectual disability, autism, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, or other similar condition to intellectual disabilities. So sometimes that's where Down syndrome fits in for folks who are DDA eligible. In addition to that, your disability has to start before the age of 18. It has to be a permanent disability, and it has to cause substantial limitations to your functioning. And those four things are all part of the state of Washington's definition of developmental disability. So DDA doesn't have a lot of wiggle room in terms of different diagnoses that we can accept because there are some specific diagnoses that are called out in the state law. With that being said, for younger kids, we can make them eligible under a temporary eligibility category called developmental delay. And that means that you have up to 3 qualifying developmental delays in areas of cognitive, adaptive, motor, social, and I'm forgetting the last one, but you need to have 3 out of the 5 areas of delay. And that's a temporary eligibility category. It's not specifically mentioned in the statute, but it's a way for us to make young children eligible until they've had an opportunity to maybe get a firm diagnosis or to maybe get a cognitive test through their school district to become eligible in a permanent category. So those are the types of folks that DDA is allowed to make eligible. It's a documentation-based eligibility determination, so we review mostly school records and medical documents to come up with those decisions.
And so as folks are kicking off this process, what are some of the best ways they can do that? And maybe Scott, you could weigh in here a little bit, because I know the ARC helps people navigate this system. So like just very first steps if someone is at the beginning of this journey, right?
Yeah,
sure.
And I'll say too, kind of even in response to the first question of just like, what is DDA? I think that I hear a lot of times from parents like, oh, I heard somebody told me that I need to get on the waiver, or I heard a DDA, but I don't really know exactly what it is. That's actually a really common question that we get, is like, I heard this because my kiddo's teacher mentioned it, or I have a friend who has an older kid with a disability and they're in DDA. So likely you've heard of it, and sometimes it has different names depending on who you talk to. So first, right, like you have to just be what we call a DDA client, right? And that is exactly kind of what Chris has been talking about, is just kind of getting in the front door. I have a colleague who actually, she has a really good way of sort of describing DDA as this restaurant that you kind of hear of through your friends. And then you go, and it's kind of like, it's like an exclusive restaurant a little bit. Like you want to get inside because you hear it, but there's kind of bouncers at the door. And that's like kind of what we talk about with this application process, right? You have to sort of have all of the right things. You have to have the diagnosis. You have to have the adaptive skills test, right? You need a certain amount of stuff to get into the door of the DDA restaurant, if you will. And the ARC of King County, like what we help people do is sort of get an idea of like, what are all of those different things that you need to get in, that you need to submit with your application. You know, there's a lot of kind of complicated questions on that application, or sometimes they need to be answered in a certain way. So we sort of help people work through, like, what is this question really asking? How do you answer this question in a way that accurately reflects your child's need? So that's kind of, you know, what I say is when people are sort of in those beginning processes, or you're like, I heard of DDA, I think my kid might be eligible to be in DDA, come to the ARC, because we can, at the very beginning, just sort of start to get an idea of like, okay, could you be a DDA client? Could you get in the door of the restaurant? Would you be eligible for services beyond getting in the door of the restaurant? So that's what I would say as far as like, you know, where to sort of start your process.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Chris, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, no, I just, yeah, so as Scott mentioned, there is an application process. There's an application packet that DDA has put together. There's a link to download the application materials in my presentation. There's an application form itself, which is probably what Scott is referring to. There can be some of the questions can sometimes seem a little complicated, but most of the application form is demographic information about the person who's being applied for, and then the representative, usually the parent or guardian of the person who's applying. So we collect that information. There's questions about whether the applicant needs interpretation, or whether documentation needs to be sent out in a different language, and there's a space to write the language for the applicant and the representative. So that form needs to be filled out. And I know Scott at the ARC and I know the other ARCs that we collaborate with around the region are all really good at helping people fill out the application and getting back to us if they have questions. The second form in the application packet is a consent form. The consent form allows DDA to request copies of documentation that will support your eligibility. So, you know, the things to list on that consent form are things like the applicant's school district, the applicant's doctor or medical center, or any other source where there might be psychological evaluations or other documentation that provides IQ scores or adaptive test scores or things like that. Applicants can also provide copies of the documents that they want us to look at. Sometimes applicants do both, provide copies and give us a consent form so we can get other stuff that we might need that they might not have. So basically that's the first step of the process. And I think Scott and the rest of his colleagues at the ARC, you know, they do a great job of helping people actually, you know, get through that app, you know, get to the application and then kind of submit it. And then, you know, what kind of answer the questions about what kinds of documentation they need, what would be helpful. And I know that I've worked pretty closely with Scott and the rest of his team over there over the last several years on a number of cases where, you know, there's kind of a back and forth and a collaboration about what's helpful, what's not, what do you need to make this person eligible. So definitely work collaboratively with the ARC on that side.
That's great. Thank you. And then, you know, I know folks really would love to understand like how long it takes, like from the time that you submit the application to really understanding what services that you're eligible for, maybe what funding you'll get. And then are there, I'll just add this because I think it's probably part of this question, are there differences depending on age with that timeline too?
Okay, so with regards to the eligibility process, because that's the part of the process that I have the most control over, our goal is to get applications done within 90 days. Now, with that being said, you know, we had a lull in applications at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and we're now getting about 35 applications a week in the Linwood office. So, you know, there is a bit of a backlog that we are working through, but our goal is to always get those in and out within 90 days. It's helpful if you can provide copies of all of the documentation that we need with your application. That does help us process it a little quicker. And I know that's one of the things that I've worked with Scott and his colleagues on is getting all of the documents together when the application comes in so that we don't have to take the time to request anything. The big part of the 90-day process, the bulk of it is spent requesting, or actually like we request the documents and then the bulk of the time is spent getting the documents to review. We've recently started to have significant delays in terms of getting medical documents back to our office when we request those. School district documents typically get turned around within a few days. With most districts, it kind of depends on breaks and whether people are in the office or not. So our goal is to get those in and out within 90 days. Now, with regards to services, the timeline can be a little bit longer. And I don't have as much control over that part of the process, but it kind of depends on the types of services that you are looking for and what kind of funding that you have available to you. So if, for example, a child or an adult applies for DDA and becomes eligible and also has Medicaid eligibility at the same time they become eligible for DDA, they could probably request an assessment for personal care services and get those services starting within 2 or 3 months. It kind of depends on how long it takes to get a provider in place. With regards to a waiver, those can take more time because waivers are complicated, and you know, the first step is to have an assessment and then for you to be approved for funding for a waiver service. And the approval for the funding comes from headquarters. It's not in Olympia, it's not a decision that's made locally. And then once you're approved for a waiver, there are a number of other forms that need to be filled out that the case manager helps walk the client or the family through. And then once all of those forms are completed, services can start. So waivers definitely take longer than, say, somebody who's looking for a caregiver or some other services through like that are Medicaid funded.
Yeah, so one quick question, what is a waiver? I think that's an immediate one for folks.
Yeah, so that's a quick question, but unfortunately it's not a quick answer. So in a nutshell, waivers are federal programs that where the federal government provides half of the funding, state governments provide the other half of the funding, and the federal government provides funding based on the fact that a kiddo meets or a person meets certain criteria. So the person has to be eligible for DDA. They have to be eligible for Social Security. They have to be eligible for Medicaid. It's called a waiver because the final step in the approval process for getting onto a waiver is that you waive a right to institutional placement because the federal government provides funding to the states for services in an institution, and the waiver is to receive those same services in the community. So for parents of young children, it's kind of a weird concept to think about, but that's technically what a waiver is. I mean, you're waiving your federal right to receive services in an institution in order to receive them in the community. And another way to think about a waiver is like a menu of services. So to continue Scott's analogy of the restaurant at DDA, when you're approved for a waiver, you have a certain dollar amount that you have available to you, and you have kind of a menu of services that you can work with your case manager on getting. So things like respite and maybe like assistive technology. Some of our waivers offer long-term job coaching support. One of our waivers, the core waiver, offers a program called supported living, mostly for adults. So there's a variety of different services offered through a waiver. So if you're approved for a waiver and go through all of the steps, then you have access to that kind of menu of services. And one of my handouts actually describes all of the services that can be available on a waiver. On the different waivers, DDA has 5 of them. And they all come with different types of services and different amounts of money available to you.
So I know, as my family went through the process with our son, we worked with fantastic case managers, but it sometimes felt like there were things that we just didn't know about it because we didn't even know to ask the question, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, Scott, with if someone wants to work with you all at the ARC, they're eligible, they have a great case manager, but what's the added benefit of coming to you at that point? Like, are you all set up to help navigate and help people make those decisions? Because once you're eligible, you might be qualified for a bunch of things. You might want a bunch of things, but you don't always know what's on that menu. And sometimes it's hard to parse or even find the information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Kate, kind of exactly that. It's like there's so much that you can get through DDA and through the DDA waivers, but unless you sort of know what it is that you're looking for and what you need, it's not necessarily offered to you. So it's like an analogy of back to the restaurant. And Chris, I appreciate you sort of extending it there too, right? You're through the door, you're in sort of the waiting room of the DDA restaurant, but there's not necessarily a host that's bringing you to a table or handing you a drink menu usually. Sometimes that's not the case, but a lot of times folks kind of enter in and they have to find their own way. Mm-hmm. So really, you need to sort of find a host and ask for a table. And in that regard, I mean, like if you're needing a waiver, you need to kind of specifically go find and ask for it. And what we're able to do at the ARC is even instruct people like, where do you go and who do you, what are you asking for? And then when you get that seed, right, there are all these combo platters, as we like to sort of make the analogy, right? Or as Chris said, like a menu of services. But all of these different waivers that exist, they kind of come as package deals, right? There's no a la carte options in DDA. Like you have to sort of accept the packages. So if you're eligible for what maybe usually people are eligible for what we call like the IFS waiver, individual and family support waiver, you have to sort of demonstrate and exhaust all of the different services that are on that waiver in order to sort of upgrade to the next one in a lot of cases. And similarly, if you're talking to a case manager, even the best case manager, and you say something like, well, my child, they need housing or support around housing. DDA will generally say, well, we don't do housing, and that's true, right? But there are different types of residential supports that are available through DDA. If you're able to sort of ask it of your case manager in a way that sort of matches the language of DDA, they're better able to sort of serve and support you. And a lot of times families no one just knows that language, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we can help with, is say, all right, it sounds like maybe some of the things that you need include employment support and maybe a little bit of like residential support in the future. So maybe we want to think about the core waiver as an option. There's not many of them, but like, let's start thinking about how we might request those types of services, and whether or not you might be eligible for those services.
And so the ARC can really do that kind of translation and hand-holding all along the process, regardless of where you are in terms of eligibility or age.
Exactly.
Is that true?
We try our best to, yeah. and sometimes there are things that we learn that we are either new and changing in DDA, or just new scenarios or new situations that people are experiencing. So a lot of times we're learning alongside families too. But yes, exactly. That's a perfect way of putting it, is like we kind of walk alongside folks when they're sort of hitting snags in the road.
Yeah. Okay, so at a high level, because I know this is complicated, but I think it would be really useful for folks to understand the different services that are available at different ages and what that breakdown is. And I would say even what are those moments when you need to be prepared to make a switch in terms of your child transitioning to a new age group. And Chris, maybe you could start us off on that one.
Well, so first of all, there are some exceptions to this statement, but generally speaking, most services are available. If you're on a particular waiver, age is not the deciding factor with regards to what services you get. It's more based on the assessment and what the needs are identified in the assessment. So there are some services that don't make sense for young children, like supported living on the core waiver is probably not going to be a realistic service for young children. But if you're on the core waiver, you can talk to your case manager about it. There are some kids in residential placements. The services you receive from DDA are more driven by the assessment. So it's not really about age, but in terms of eligibility, there are some definite ages where people, I think, need to be aware that their eligibility might be expiring and then need to reapply. So the first is at age 4. When we make kids eligible as birth to 3 children through the birth to 3 system, or just any child under the age of 3, that eligibility expires automatically in our system at 4. And families are sent a notice about 6 months prior to that that asks them to reapply and gives them contact information about who to call and how to reapply. And so we suggest people reapply early. So that gives us lots of time to get that application into the system and get it processed. If we don't get an application after the 6 month point, we send another letter out 90 days prior to the birth date. So that's another notice to the family that the eligibility is expiring. The other point where that can happen is at age 10. If we make you eligible under developmental delay, that's a temporary eligibility category, and that expires at age 10. So a similar process follows at age 9 years and 6 months, where we send that first letter out with instructions, and then we send another letter out about 90 days ahead of time. And we do, again, encourage people to reapply early, especially for the age 10 reapplication, because that's the point where we need to have the information about the diagnosis and the IQ testing and the adaptive skills testing, and we have to have all of that together before we can make you eligible from age 10 forward. The last age where we do eligibility reviews is between 19 and 20. And that's the last, typically that's the last eligibility review DDA will do. And that's kind of just making sure that the individual continues to meet the eligibility requirements, because in some cases it's been several years since we either made them eligible or last reviewed their eligibility. So that's the last review that we do.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. So when it comes to eligibility and diagnosis, if a child is diagnosed at birth or before birth with Down syndrome, what are the other things that they need in order to be eligible in addition to that diagnosis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for young children that are going through the birth to 3 system, the Down syndrome diagnosis doesn't make a big difference. If they're eligible for birth to 3 services, then they're eligible for DDA. So, you know, I know that having a diagnosis of Down syndrome will qualify a child for early intervention on their end, but you don't need to necessarily provide documentation of that for DDA at that age. At age 4, a child with a diagnosis of Down syndrome, if they've had an IQ test and if they've had an adaptive skills test, we can potentially make them eligible until age 20, when we would review them again. The problem with that is that a lot of children, in fact, I would say most children at age 4 have not had a cognitive test that we can use for a permanent category. So, you know, things like a Wechsler or another sort of formal standardized cognitive test.
Yep.
Most of the time, children with Down syndrome are made eligible under developmental delay based on school evaluations that are done when they exit from birth to 3, or just school district evaluations that are done at some point when they're under the age of 10. So, you know, if those school evaluations show delays in 3 areas, then we can typically make a child eligible that way. And then at age 10, they would need to have documentation of the diagnosis, which we might already have in the file if they've provided it with a previous application. And then they would need to have an IQ test and an adaptive skills test. And I will say on the handout that you'll receive after the panel tonight, the list of IQ tests and adaptive skills tests that we can accept are on the back side of the handout called Required Documentation for DDA Eligibility.
Okay.
That document itself is kind of a, for lack of a better word, kind of a cheat sheet on DDA. It provides a quick list of the diagnoses we can accept and the types of documentation that we typically need for those to make somebody eligible in each category.
Great. Scott, you look like you had something to add to that.
Oh, no, I was actually just going to reference that exact sheet that Chris mentioned. I mean, I think what's important to sort of note about DDA is many people will be eligible to be a DDA client and to receive services, but not everyone, right? For a lot of various reasons, but if you know, or maybe you were once eligible and you no longer would be. So I think it's just important to sort of put that out there too. Like, many people will be eligible, but DDA does not serve every person with a developmental disability in Washington State, which is why there are such, which is part of why there are just so many different forms and tests that sort of need to happen in order to become eligible. The other thing I'll say is that, yeah, like Chris mentions, a lot of times people who receive birth to 3 had no idea that they were a DDA client until they got kicked out, right? And that's just kind of, you know, they're like, well, I didn't know yet. Or they received something in the mail from
Right.
DSHS, and they just sort of assume that it's junk mail because they didn't know that they were a client. So a lot of times people get kicked out without even really knowing that it happens. So if you are a DDA client, just kind of do the best that you can to be attentive to the mail that's coming in, because there is a chance that you could be getting sort of your notification that you're sort of up for that reapplication period.
And so is the bottom line essentially that you could have a diagnosis of Down syndrome, but not have an IQ that meets the level that would be required for eligibility for DDA? Or is it way more complicated than that?
It's a potential possibility. I would say that most of the time, and this is just kind of a broad generalization, so know that, but I would say most of the time when somebody has a diagnosis of Down syndrome, the issue that blocks them from eligibility is not so much the IQ score. It's more the adaptive test scores that happen with schools. And it's most likely to happen when a child is older, age 19 or 20, when they're going through like a transition program. And one of the things that happens with adaptive skills tests is that they're often administered by school psychologists who will, as part of the student's annual IEP, will give a form to the teacher and a form to the parents, or several forms to the parents to fill out and a form to the teacher to fill out. And sometimes all we get back, or all the school psychologist gets back, is that form from the teacher, because the parents forget to turn it in, or don't turn it in on time, or don't get the form, or there's some other sort of circumstance that happens. And what can happen when the teacher is the only one that returns that adaptive skills test form is that the student scores above our cutoff, because the teacher is kind of looking at how that student does at school, right? And if they've been in a system for a long time and they know what the expectations are and they can get along pretty well in the school system just by itself, then the score might be higher than what is actually real. Like, the parent score is probably more the real score. So I think my recommendation would be to make sure that if you get a form like that from your school psychologist, to make sure you get that filled out and get back on time, so that there's a couple of scores to look at to compare to. It's sort of embarrassing, but we have had situations where people have a diagnosis of Down syndrome and people have IQs that are low enough to qualify, but because of those adaptive skills test scores, they either become ineligible, or, you know, we have to wait on additional documentation before we can make them eligible.
Great. And that's probably a moment where the ARC could be super helpful too, right, Scott? Just to help folks navigate, and if they need to reapply because they're not eligible, just to be sure that all the correct paperwork is there, right? Yeah. Okay, so we only have 20 minutes left. I'm going to get to some of the questions that have come through. One, folks are interested in how families can use DDA funds for DSC programs. And I am aware that we can use them for our learning programs. I don't know, Chris or Scott, if this is actually something that you can answer. I might, Caitlin, ask you to step in. That's what I am aware of. So if there's anything else that folks want to weigh in on, I would be happy to, we should share that with our families.
What kind of service is the DSC contracted to provide?
I believe it's for our learning program. So
Okay.
I don't know, Caitlin, if you want to add to that. To call on you out of turn, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Yes, we can use it for the learning program. You can use it for the puberty program, the Understanding Adolescence and Puberty program. And those are the two main programs you can use it for.
Cool, thank you, appreciate it. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to say, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you guys have a contract for like a technical assistance or some sort of supportive parenting sort of service or something like that. Is that, I mean, I guess in a nutshell, you would a person would probably have to be approved for a DDA waiver, and then you would have to, okay, so it sounds like the contract is for respite. Okay, so yeah, that's a waiver service. So a person would have to be provided, the person would have to be approved for a waiver. And then if you're approved for a waiver, you should talk to your case manager about respite and about how to use DSC or how to get DSC on board, or because the way you use a service is that you have to use a contracted provider. So the case manager, if you have access to respite funding, the case manager can set up an authorization to DSC for that particular service and then kind of let you know how to use it from there.
Great, thank you. Another question we had is how long the wait might be to hear back on a reapplication. This is for a child who just turned 4.
Yeah, so it depends. So the way the reapplication process works is that, typically we ask for those 6 months in advance, but sometimes we get them even before that time frame. So sometimes people know they need to reapply before the age of 4, and so they send in their reapplications, 11, 10, 9 months in advance. And those get into our system, but they don't get immediately worked because the staff I have that process the reapplications are focused more on everything that's coming up within the current 90 days. So if you've submitted a reapplication and you haven't heard anything, it might be that it's just that we haven't gotten to it yet. Because we're not working on that particular birth month of applications, or we're working ahead of that birth month. But if you have particular questions, please, you can email me offline. My contact information is in the packet. Maybe someone could put it in the chat. I think Caitlin has it. You could call me or email me, and I'd be happy to let you know what specifically is going on with that circumstance.
Great, thank you. Another one, let's see, what services might be available for a kid that is around 4?
So it would first depend on the assessment. So the assessment identifies unmet needs, and it's fairly comprehensive. A case manager comes out to your home, and with, right now we're not coming out to the home. We're doing them mostly online, but there is a home visit, a brief home visit component that's required right now during the COVID emergency. But the assessment is designed to identify unmet needs, and then from there a service plan is developed. So, it depends on what kinds of things you need. So if you need like caregiving services and have Medicaid, that might be part of your service plan. If you want a service that's on the waiver menu of services, that'll be a little bit more complex, and your case manager has to submit a request for funding approval for a waiver service. But it just kind of depends on the assessment. So, without knowing more information, it would be tough to answer that question specifically.
Yeah. Scott, you look like you were going to weigh in there.
Yeah, I mean, again, it is like Chris mentioned, it's sort of case by case. A lot of times I'll hear from families like, oh, we're doing okay, we don't really need anything yet, and maybe their kid is around 4 or 5 or however old, right? And, you know, I always encourage families, no matter what, even if you're in a place where you're not really needing respite or a caregiver or any type of sort of concrete support, I encourage folks to apply anyway, just at least to be in the DDA system, because once you're in the system, it will be easier if a need does come up in the future to have that met. So once you're in, you know, then you can request, you know, the assessment to get a DDA waiver, or you know, if you're finding that you do need caregiver support, which is actually a type of Medicaid service that's a lot easier to get than anything that would be available through a DDA waiver. And, you know, we can kind of talk about that too, if ever needed. But I encourage folks to apply regardless. And even if it does take a long time to get a waiver, at least you're in the door, right? Like, don't let the waits or the major sort of application stuff or the assessments and all that put you off from getting into the system in the first place, because, you know, once you're in, you have at least a little bit of safeguard around you, as opposed to having to, you know, oh my gosh, all of a sudden, like, things have changed and maybe my kiddo, I mean, not to scare anyone, but like maybe like now like there's some behavior challenges, and maybe like things are getting a little bit more challenging for me as a parent, and now I have to wait maybe even 90 days to just get into DDA, let alone get services, right? So I always say, you know, get in the front door, and then as far as things that can be available, there's a ton of different things, and from there, that's when you can kind of work with a case manager to sort of identify what you and your child needs. Very commonly, it's respite, right? So literally a break for you as a parent, because the care needs of your child are beyond what maybe a non-disabled kiddo would have, right? So there is services and supports for you to be able to sort of get a short little break for maybe a few hours every week or so, or, you know, a few hours a month. It usually comes in sort of hours like that, but that's a common support that folks utilize too, and is often one of the more popular ones that you would get through a waiver.
Yeah. So we have a family asking about the wait list and how long it is, and I'm not sure on what specific wait list that is. I know for our family, we put our son in the moment we could and didn't hear anything from DDA until he was 9 or 10. And this family is asking about a child who's 14. So I'm not clear, like myself, what that wait list was that we were on, and if that still exists. Is that for eligibility? How long is it? Or is it once you're eligible, then it's for funding? How does that work?
Yeah, so DDA doesn't have a wait list for the waivers anymore per se. We used to have a wait list for what was called our family support program, and that's an older program that we don't have anymore. But what we do have is a waiver database. So it's not like a wait list implies that, you know, there's an order and there's a spot on, you know, that, you know, a certain number of people have to go off the waiver before you can get your waiver, et cetera. What we keep now is a database, so that if you request a waiver and the waiver funding is not available and your request is denied, your name goes into a waiver database, so that if you have to, you know, if your needs change and you want to re-request the waiver, you can do that. You know, you do stay in the system as an eligible client, even if you're not on a waiver. So it's not really a wait list per se, but it is a database where we do kind of keep track of what people are requesting and what people are needing. So that data helps us advocate for additional funding from the legislature when that time comes.
So then if someone is feeling like they're stuck and they need services now, I'm hoping they can reach out to you, Chris. We have your email there to kind of get that question answered specifically for their child.
Yeah, yes, for sure.
Great. Go ahead, Scott.
I just want to clarify. So because there's not a wait list for waivers, right? What some families maybe don't always know is that if they're denied, they're not gonna eventually be contacted
Right.
with the waiver. Like, you do need to reapply for that waiver as your needs change, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of times I hear, there's this sort of, some people hear about this wait list that doesn't really exist, and people think that they're on a wait list, but really they're in this database that Chris is talking about. And it's just important to know that just because you're in that database doesn't mean DDA is going to give you a call and say, oh, guess what? Your waiver is ready. You do need to reach out to your case manager to reapply. And, just because you were denied once, perhaps your needs have changed, perhaps things have become more challenging, or there might be new information to sort of add or be reassessed on. So you can and should, quite frankly, apply for waivers multiple times as things in your family change.
Right. Thanks, Scott. That's a great point. So one of the things that happens when and if your waiver is denied, your funding is denied, is that DDA does send out a letter, an annual letter after that denial, kind of asking you if your needs have changed. And if your needs have changed, here's a number that you can call to request another assessment to start a new waiver application. So, I mean, Scott's correct. I mean, it's not a wait list where we're going to call you and say it's your time to come on down and get your waiver. But we do send out a letter that says if your needs have changed or if you would like another assessment, please call this number to request an assessment and get that going again. And that happens, I think, on an annual basis.
Okay. And then can you speak to the situation with funding for waivers? Like, I'm not aware of, if we run out, or how does that work?
Right. So remember that waivers are a cost share. So it's a cost share between the state and federal government, where the federal government provides 50% of the funding. So waiver slots are dependent upon the availability of a spot on a waiver is dependent upon the state's ability to provide their half of the funding for the services for the slot. So, if it's not a situation where, all the slots are full or anything like that, because people are coming off and on waivers all the time because, either they're not using a service through the waiver, or they go to a different waiver like Scott was talking about before, where somebody's needs have changed and they need a different waiver. So that opens up a spot for somebody else. So it's really impossible to say whether or not like a waiver request will be approved or denied when you request it. But what I can say is that if funding is not available, then you will stay in that database and you'll get that letter every year that, you can re-request the waiver that way. But if it's approved and there's funding available, then you'll get that information from your case manager and then you can move forward in the process.
Okay, so we are really quickly running out of time. So I'm going to try and fit in one more question. Hopefully this is a fairly quick one. And then I'm hoping to, if there are some leftover questions, Caitlin, I'm hoping that maybe we can either connect folks with Chris or Scott, or get the questions answered and get them back to them. If there's something that we've missed, I apologize. I think the one that I thought you might be able to answer